Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ACES webinar series. Today we have a special collaborative webinar with CACREP joining us with a panel presentation. Just a few reminders for our attendees. During the presentation, only the presenters' mics will be live and active, so you won't be able to turn your mics on and off. If you have any questions, have any trouble, please feel free to use the chat feature. If you have questions for the presenters related to the topics that are here, be sure to send those through. You want to make sure that your speakers and headphones are working prior to the start of the webinar. If you have any audio trouble, feel free to send me a chat message. On that topic, my name is Eric Perry. I am a professor of clinical counseling at Southern New Hampshire University and your ACES social media and web coordinator. So without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get us started and pass our presentation over to our representatives from CACREP.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the ASCS and CACREP webinar. I am happy that you all have taken the time to join us this morning. We're going to talk about writing a self-study to the intersection of CACREP, ASCA SPA, and the CAEP standards. So to take a few moments, we'd like to introduce ourselves as your two facilitators for this session. I am Sajal Fox at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, Associate Professor and Department Chair. I'm also Vice Chair of the CACREP Board, and specific to our program, we do have a 60 credit hour school counselor preparation program.
And I'm Amy Milsom. I'm a professor and department chair at Appalachian State University. We also have a 60 credit hour school counseling program that's accredited by CACREP and CAEP, and I'm a board member for CACREP.
So our overview or focus for today is that we're going to take some time to talk about ASCA, which is a specialized professional association, or SPA, under CAEP. And we've developed school counselor preparation curricular content standards. And the idea is to review programs and grant national recognition, which in turn also facilitates unit accreditation by CAEP. So today we have presenters from CACREP accredited programs who will share their strategies and experiences in successfully meeting those two separate sets of standards related to CACREP and CAEP. So our specific learning objectives for today, our presenters will focus on identifying areas of overlap in program and curricular standards of CACREP, the ASCA SPA, and CAEP. Examining evidences that may be used to support compliance to standards in those areas of overlap, and describing processes to write a self-study to address the spirit and letter of those sets of standards.
So we were fortunate to be able to secure panelists from two institutions. We actually were intentional about seeking people representing the school counseling programs and somebody representing the CAEP accreditation at the college level. So the University of Memphis and the University of Virginia are represented. And I would first, if you'll switch that, thank you, ask our panelists from the University of Memphis to introduce themselves, please.
Yes, hi. My name is Michelle Brasfield. I've been an assistant professor and the coordinator of school counseling at the University of Memphis since fall of 17. And I was the school counseling representative during our recent CACREP reaccreditation. We do still have a 48-hour program. I serve as the school counseling designee for CAEP as well as SACS, which is the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, our regional accreditor.
And Mary, if you would go ahead and introduce yourself, please.
Okay, I'm Mary Ransdell, and I'm a clinical professor in the Department of Curriculum, Instruction and Curriculum Leadership at the University of Memphis. For the past 8 years, I've served as the first NCAEP coordinator, now CAEP coordinator, and director of assessment and accreditation for the college. I also collect and report the SACS data for our department, just like Melissa mentioned for her department. I complete the federal Title II reports, the CAEP annual reports, along with some teaching duties. But I'm not in counseling. My content area is elementary education.
Thank you. And then our panelists from the University of Virginia, if you would please introduce yourselves.
Hi, everyone. My name is Blair Chalawa, and I am in my 6th year at the University of Virginia after being at Keene University for a couple years prior to that. I've coordinated completed 2 self-studies and 2 site visits and serve on site visit teams for CACREP. But we just completed our CACREP site visit and are coordinating right now with Mandy Turner to submit our CAEP self-study. So we're in the throes of this and learning a lot, and so happy to be here to share our experience and hopefully help you in the process.
And hi, everyone. I'm Mandy Turner. I'm the Director of Assessment and Accreditation at the Curry School at UVA. And so I'm the liaison both for CAEP and for our regional accreditor, SACS, Commission on Colleges and Schools as well. And I have been with Curry since the summer of 2017, and I also served in a similar role at the University of Connecticut at the NEAG school there, and in a related role at the Connecticut State Department of Education. So I've sort of come at accreditation and looking at the similarities and differences and overlap between specialty areas of accreditation and CAEP from a few different perspectives. So thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you all. We're so glad that you were able to join us today. So our first talking point for our panelists is to please share what prompted you to seek school counseling program accreditation through both CAEP and CACREP, and maybe share what specific circumstances led you to this determination and how are your program faculty feeling about this decision. So Blair, can we turn to you first, so please share?
Sure, absolutely. I'll speak to CAEP first because that's the most clear cut. We're required by our state, Virginia Department of Education, to maintain national accreditation from CAEP. And so because the state dictates it, we do it. So I think that makes it an easy step. Well, not easy, but a clear-cut answer. As far as CACREP, we were one of the first universities to kind of back in, I don't even know the year, but first universities to go through the accreditation process, and then been CACREP accredited ever since. Our program feels, I'd say the majority of our faculty are really passionate about making sure that we follow the CACREP standards so that there's a standardization across the profession. And so that's just kind of it in our history. And so we're maintaining that and dedicated to improving our program and making sure we're covering what our students need to know based on standards and procedures set out by CACREP.
Great, thank you. Michelle, can you share a little bit?
Sure. So the counseling program at U of M has been CACREP accredited since '93, so that's just not even in question for us to work on continuing that. Our decision to seek the CAEP accreditation is supported by the leadership of our department, college, university. Like all universities, University of Memphis works diligently to improve our rankings by demonstrating program quality and effectiveness. CAEP, CACREP, they're just seen as extra layers to support this mission. As far as our faculty, I also feel like they really understand the importance of multiple accreditations. You know, the faculty, students, and future employers really want programs with high standards. And since having all these multiple accreditations are, you know, that's not a simple process, it can really be quite arduous. We realize the value and necessity of teamwork in this endeavor, working together across our programs and colleges throughout the campus.
Thank you. So we have 2 examples here, one where the state has required the institution to have CAEP, and then the institution already had a history of having CACREP, and then also an institution that has been CAEP, but CACREP, but also the leadership has made a determination to support the pursuit of obtaining CAEP as well. So it seems like if we want to think about it, the idea of just ensuring further quality assurance for the programs through both sets of standards. So can either one of you speak to just specifically when we think about, the work that it does take to maintain two sets of standards and seek two sets of standards, let alone one. And you, Michelle, you talked about the team effort piece. Can you talk briefly, either one of you, about how you have sort of encouraged faculty, get everybody on board through just the idea of meeting two separate sets of standards?
Yes, so Mary Rainstill has actually been leading that through our college, so she may want to speak more to that.
Hello, this is Mary. May I speak?
Yes, please do, Mary.
Oh, okay. Yes, we definitely have worked a lot in collaborating. As I mentioned a little bit later on, CAEP accredits as colleges of education, and sometimes that incorporates people from people and programs from other colleges, i.e. arts and sciences, health studies, sometimes psychology. Now, our counseling department happens to be within the College of Education, so it's easy for us to for me to walk downstairs and to talk with and collaborate with people in the counseling program and the leadership program. It's also in our building and in our college. So it does take a lot of going back and forth and sometimes higher level dean to dean collaboration so that faculty work together. But people do understand that both entities are well respected. Both CACREP and CAEP fall under the CHIA heading, which is the colleges of education across the country. It recognizes the accrediting bodies for higher education. So is recognized, both are recognized, both are at the same level, and we can collaborate because we know that this is very important for our institutions, state for our programs, for all kinds of reasons. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mary. Appreciate that.
So we're going to shift to what I'm thinking is probably going to be where the bulk of our conversation is going to be this morning, to talking about how the programs are approaching meeting two different sets of standards. I know that people kind of get a little overwhelmed thinking about so many things to address, and our goal was to try to help make that a little more concrete for people. I'm looking at our bullet points and thinking maybe if our first presenters, if maybe we focus on the first two, because those will be a little quicker, and then we'll jump to the last two. So I'm wondering, Mandy, if you might be willing to talk about just timeframes when you're up for accreditation, where you are in the process, what you've done so far related to accreditation.
Sure. So we just earned full CACREP accreditation and last year, so we're pretty set for a few years with CACREP, but then our CAEP accreditation cycle, we're in the midst of it right now. So we will have our on-site visit, working backwards, which is generally how I like to approach prepping for accreditation. We'll have our on-site visit in the fall semester of 2021. So that means that our CAEP self-study report will be due typically around May of 2021, so at the end of the spring semester. And so right now, so we're about a year out from submitting the self-study report. And right now, what I'm doing is getting our team, our CAEP team together, and that includes our initial preparation. So as one of the previous speakers, I think Mary mentioned, the CAEP accredits the entire institution. And so therefore there's, teacher preparation and clinical school psychology preparation included, among others. And so I'm pulling together the whole team, and that includes Dr. Chalawa Blair, who's on this webinar today, and then also our program coordinators from those other programs. And we're just specking out steps and the timeline for writing the self-study report, collecting all the data. So we're really looking at about a year and a couple months process for preparing for that self-study report right now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And it sounds like you're dividing up the work and kind of parsing stuff out. You said something earlier, though, I think that's important to highlight, is that, the timelines for CACREP and CAEP in most cases aren't going to intersect. And so, you're probably going to engage in one of those processes first, with the other one following not far along. So hopefully there's a lot that's overlapping.
That's true.
Yeah, Mary,
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could speak to the same 2 points of, your accreditation timeline and what you've been doing so far.
Sure. Our CAEP visit is a little bit later than what Mandy was mentioned. We're actually in the spring of 2022. So we're also working backwards. We do that as well. Our self-study report, I have my deadline internally of the end of July of 2021. We've started to get a lot of our groups together, our teams together. We are looking at the CAEP standards. There was a change. We had NCAEP for many years, and then 2 different accrediting bodies came together and created CAEP. So the standards are a little bit different. There's a lot of similarities, but a little bit different. So in helping my people understand some of those standards and what is involved, we've actually started already. Well, let me back up just a moment, though. Our CACREP accreditation was in fall of 18, and we came through with flying colors, much to the credit of Mandy, or excuse me, not Mandy, of Michelle and her colleagues downstairs in counseling psychology. And their next visit for CACREP will be in 2025. So they are coasting along very well. Data gathering, studying our standards right now. We're planning meetings to write the self-study report. And we have different levels of meetings. We have a steering committee, we have a writing committee, we have smaller committees for each of the standards. We are involving as many faculty members as possible so that each can eventually speak to all of the standards. And like I mentioned briefly, outside of the College of Education, we have other people. So we're trying to involve as many of those faculty as we can so that we get everybody's data accurately and we can portray their programs clearly. So it is a long process, and you want to be intentional about gathering the data for either accrediting body and making sure that you have what you need. So we've begun.
Thank you. Well, and it sounds like, both of you have sort of this 1 to 2 years out is really when the bulk of that work starts to, the focused intentional work starts to happen. There's a lot that goes on, in between accreditation cycles. And I think we probably all had that scramble moment, but a 1 to 2 year time frame of scramble doesn't make it feel so intense. But I also heard you talk about the importance of involving many people, and I think emphasizing the fact that this is not something that should be done by one person, or that a couple individuals are responsible for, that the collaborative efforts of all the faculty who are relevant to the programs should be having input is important. To shift then, and I guess I'll just remind our audience, there is a PDF file that you have access to. Eric linked it. I think our presenters are going to refer to that now. But basically now we're going to talk about what our panelists have seen or experienced as some of the similarities and differences in the CACREP and the CAEP standards as they've been working on writing to them. So we're hoping that this will be beneficial. I would say, Mandy, whenever you need us to jump to that next slide, just let us know. I think we'll leave this one up for now, but we can move when we need to. So if you're willing to start with you, can you talk a little bit about similarities and differences in these sets of standards, Mandy?
Sure, absolutely. So the part of the timeline and working backwards to make sure that we are collecting the right data and addressing all of the standards for both accrediting bodies actually is ensuring that we make very obvious and sort of interrogate the overlap between the CAEP standards and specifically the CAEP advanced program standards, because that in general, and at least in Virginia's case, that's where counselor education falls for CAEP. It's an advanced program standard, so it's not an initial educator license. So we're looking at those CAEP advanced program standards, and then we're looking at the CACREP standards. And Blair and I have worked on some crosswalking document where we have identified where the CAEP standards sort of align to the CACREP standards in various areas. So there's some really obvious alignment between what CACREP expects in terms of clinical preparation and clinical experiences and assessment of those experiences. There's some really clear alignment between CACREP and CAEP and CAEP's expectations of those experiences as well. So that's an area that's pretty easy to say, oh, well, if we're collecting data for CACREP or if we're collecting data for CAEP, then we're satisfying most likely the standards for the other accrediting body as well. The trick there and the importance of the alignment and crosswalking process is, all accrediting bodies have their own sort of vernacular or jargon and language. And so just making very obvious, not only for yourself and your writing team and the folks, with whom you're working to collect data and write about it, but also when those site visitors come on site and they're reading your report and they're looking at all your evidence and data, your CAEP site visit team is going to be trained under the CAEP standards, and they may or may not have a strong familiarity with the language of the CACREP standards. And so having a document available to them so that they can see the overlap and it makes it a little more clear just ensures that they're not going to miss anything that perhaps you have presented in a way that, uses more CACREP specific language versus CAEP language or vice versa, if that makes sense.
I think so.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it sounds like you're speaking to just not only mapping it out for yourselves, but that hopefully there's a benefit for others to see how you've tried to connect.
That's right. And so just to go a little deeper, so we have a crosswalk document that I think that Blair shared with you, and I think that is going to go out to the audience. And so that identifies or makes very clear the overlap between the standards in terms of language. But then the slide that you're looking at right now is also a spreadsheet that provides overlap between the CAEP standards on the left, the broad standards, and then the CACREP specific language. So we're talking about like KPIs and KPDs, how those overlap. And then we even go further to say, and we cover these components or these learning outcomes or competencies in these particular classes, and this is how we assess. And so then that sort of allows you to start the process of saying, okay, so for CAEP then, if we're going through the CAEP accreditation process, here are the data that we need to collect from our counselor education program based on these particular assessments. And these assessments are the ones that we're going to focus on and highlight through like instrument guides and talking about validity and reliability, because that's an area where CAEP really puts a lot of emphasis. So validity and reliability of instruments. And so really we've found specifically for counselor education, I've noticed a lot of similarities between the two sets of standards, particularly around expectations of diversity. So not only diversity of your candidates, but also diversity of clinical experiences and placements, and then talking about issues of equity and access and diversity just in the profession. as a whole, as well as clinical experiences and ethics as well. Those are 3 areas that really jumped out at me where there's a lot of overlap between CAEP and CACREP.
And so it sounds like and hopefully everybody who's, again, in the audience has been able to access that PDF file, which is what you're referring to, Mandy, where you've crosswalked some of these things. You're talking about, it sounds like, standard A2 for CAEP, the partnerships for clinical preparation, where they talk about, criteria that they expect. And CACREP having section 3 is all about practicum and internship and field experience. And so there's a lot of overlap in those expectations, and it's just a matter of mapping those together. Is that accurate?
That's right, yes.
Yeah, and then the same for the diversity. CACREP has a couple standards in section 1 specific to attracting, enrolling, retaining diverse students, interviewing, admissions criteria related to diversity, that kind of thing that overlap as well. So hopefully that document is helpful for people. Yeah, and Eric has, said if anyone's having trouble, just, send him a chat message and he'll help you do that. Is there anything else in that document that you might want to highlight?
This is Blair. Can I jump in and highlight a couple things on the document that's up on the screen?
Absolutely.
Sure. So I think one thing that, so Mandy created this Excel spreadsheet, and we wanted to reference it for anybody on the participants, just because I thought it was really helpful for me as someone new to the CAEP aspect, and just recognizing again just how much we already do through CACREP. And so this isn't going to be as difficult, or it sounds overwhelming in theory, but looking at the overlap really made me feel a lot more comfortable that we're in a lot better shape than some of the other programs that have to do this as well, because of our CACREP accreditation. And so I just wanted to note that some of the things in this document, if you are in the processes of CACREP accreditation or have just gone through it, where it says applicable competencies, those are our program's program objectives. And so that's kind of what is being highlighted here. So there's that overlap, like Mandy mentioned, in terms of just language is different, but applicable competencies, those are our programs. We have 6 program objectives, and the learning criteria are the key performance indicators that are required by CACREP. And so, as you can imagine, we have to have one key performance indicator related to research, and that obviously maps on really well this data literacy piece that's required by CACREP. By CAEP. And so I think just kind of wanting to show the languaging that is the overlap here. So the applicable competencies, again, are the program objectives, and the applicable learning criteria are our key performance indicators. And so just again, you have this already. It's just kind of having to navigate the different wording and such.
Thank you, Blair. And I'll apologize to everybody. We had to split up her lovely picture. It should all just run, as one long document, but it wouldn't fit big enough on the screen for you to see the words if we did that. So hopefully you could follow the lines and see where everything lines up. Is there anything else you all want to say from UVA before we shift over?
I guess just the one other thing that I would say is really more about the materials like this that you see here that you're looking at on the screen. There are these sorts of crosswalks and templates and things like that all over the place that have been shared at the CAEP national conferences that happen twice a year. I think they've been shared at CACREP, similar conferences or gatherings of some sort. So there's not always a need to reinvent the wheel. If there's, something that you see that makes organization of language and identification of instruments and evidence and things of that nature that would make that easy for you, I think it's always people are always willing to share because we're all going through this together. So I would say don't hesitate to reach out to, ask to borrow a template or use a template or something of that nature.
Thank you. And we appreciate you being willing to share this today as well as a starting point. Mary, I'm wondering if you are willing to share some similarities and differences, again, as you see them from your perspective.
Certainly. Again, as was mentioned, I looked at our advanced CAEP standards and compared those to what is required by CACREP, and you have to understand I'm not as versed in CACREP, but I did try to look at the standards and try to walk back and forth between them. I didn't have that a full document of that, but I did see some themes, of course, of diversity that was mentioned both in the faculty and in the candidates, but technology seems to be woven throughout. Those are definitely themes that are woven throughout all of the CAEP standards. Assessment of candidates in content, knowledge, and practice is well woven throughout all of that. And according to CAEP, in Standard 1, we look at the content and pedagogical knowledge of candidates. And perhaps your new SPA, the ASCA, may help very much with that in providing the data that will feed directly into CAEP Standard 1. Ethics are looked at, dispositions. CAEP calls that non-academic criteria, but we look at the dispositions of our candidates, and both look at standardized testing. So those are some things. Data literacy, that was mentioned just before. Candidate understanding of how to analyze and conducting and reading research. Collaboration is woven throughout both sets of standards. There's an emphasis on the quality partnerships, not just CAEP calls them partnerships. Clinical sites, I think, was the term that I saw in the CACREP standards. There again, sometimes the language differs. Candidates demonstrate their competencies throughout multiple measures. Candidates seem to be monitored throughout the program with counseling for those not meeting expectations, perhaps helping them stay in the program, or maybe the candidate realizing that that's not what they want to do and finding other options. There's a lot in both sets of standards where stakeholders, be they supervisors or faculty and candidates, seem to evaluate each other and their respective programs. So there's a lot of that evaluative aspect throughout both sets of standards. CAEP Standard 5 looks at a quality assurance system, which is what we call that, or the system of evaluation where data are examined and used to inform changes. Changes are documented, so CAEP expects us to provide reasoning for our changes. It's not listed specifically spelled out, but it's definitely in the standards. We're expected to do it, but we're not given the how-to or particular documentation. Continuous improvement according to standards and relative to the needs of the field. Seem to be a lot of similarities that I noticed as I was trying to go through both of them. Again, without a strong CACREP background, but a strong CAEP background, I may have missed or misinterpreted something, but those were some of the themes that I saw throughout. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say thank you. I apologize. My phone's ringing in the background and I can't shut it off if you hear it. Are there any differences or things that really stood out aside from some of the language? I'm hearing you all say language is the thing that feels not always the same. Any other things that seem drastically different?
I could speak to that. This is Mary.
Sure.
CACREP appears to be very prescriptive, almost rigid, if I can use that term. I don't know, in looking at that from lists of requirements for each standard. There are requirements for the numbers of faculty or the percentage of faculty to students, that ratio, number of clock hours for practicum and internship. But CAEP we do have the requirement for that, but there are the types of evidence, but it's up to us to justify how we demonstrate meeting the standards. For example, there's a required GPA average for an entering cohort or a requirement to demonstrate meeting sets of standards. InTask is one of them, the Interstate New Teacher Assessment and Support Consortium standards. But CAEP doesn't prescribe a particular number of hours or days that candidates are in their clinical sites. We explain the number of days, what students do during those days. Teaching in a kindergarten classroom is going to be very different in some ways than teaching in a middle school or high school classroom. So it's up to us to explain and then justify. CACREP seems to have one set of overarching professional standards within subdivisions for the various specialty areas. CAEP has one set of standards but relies on the national standards for content standards for various disciplines such as math. There's the professional association for math, for social studies, for special education, for early childhood education. So CAEP recognizes those as having professional standards that can show meeting content. So those are some of the differences that I saw.
Mhm. Thank you. I don't know, Mandy, if there were any other things you wanted to highlight in terms of differences.
No, I mean, I agree very much so with the fact that CACREP is far more prescriptive, and it makes sense. That's the accrediting body for the entire profession nationally, and so not to say that CAEP abdicates responsibility for for ensuring that programs are meeting those standards, but in a way, CAEP does, and I think it's appropriate because those are specialty areas, those are specialized areas of study that are preparing individuals to join a profession, enter a profession, and touch the lives of children across the country. So it's appropriate, and because CACREP has employs and uses individuals, faculty members, whomever, practicing counselors, whoever, to help do site visits and to run the accrediting body itself and make sure that programs are meeting standards. It makes sense that CAEP turns to them and to ensure that those very specific profession specific standards are met. So that is most definitely an area that's different. But what is nice is that because your programs in counselor education are meeting these CACREP standards and collecting all of these data and meeting all these very specific and prescriptive standards in the specific areas of counseling and all the clinical experiences and clock hours and things of that nature. You already have all of that. You're already collecting all of that. So it's not from my perspective, when an advanced program is demonstrating that they're meeting CAEP standards, there's not a whole lot on top of or above and beyond the specialty area standards that programs need to collect or demonstrate because of the prescriptive nature of the professional standards.
This is Mary, and I would agree with that, definitely.
Thank you both. Yeah, it was somebody else.
Blair, I think there are certainly lots and lots of overlap, but there are certain things I'm just thinking of. We do follow up with your recent graduates, but CAEP requires you 3 years out to indicate whether those individuals are still retained in their employment and so forth. So there's like these basic things we absolutely do, and then there's a couple added things that you're like, oh, that's going to be an added piece to follow up on those graduates to find out, are they still in their employment and so forth. And so I think most of it overlaps, and then there'll be these extra things that you have to do that we haven't had to do for CACREP.
That's that's a great point, Blair. And maybe looking at it from a CACREP, more CACREP centric perspective, it's a little bit easier to see the differences in the extra add-ons that CAEP requires of programs. And from you saying that, Blair, that made me think too, CAEP Standard 4 is all about program impact and demonstrating graduates' impact on P12 students, growth and development, both academically and, personally and socially, and, demonstrating that impact in ways that maybe are a bit different from what CACREP or the specialty areas expect. And so, that's a bit of a learning curve, I think, for advanced programs. So maybe standard 4 would be an area too that I would point out and say there's some different, there are some differences there.
Yeah, I think you're right. They added, I think we add in different ways. There are many things that CACREP looks at that CAEP does not, and there are quite a number of things too that CAEP looks at that CACREP does not. So these kinds of conversations are very good.
Well, thank you all for your input. It sounds like, and again, this is why these partnerships between CACREP and CAEP staff and faculty on campuses are so important, because you both look at and can probably more quickly identify certain things that there are going to be unique aspects related to CAEP or to CACREP, but there's going to be a lot of commonality. And so it's a matter of identifying what fits where. Before we shift to our next talking point, there was a question that came in that I thought maybe I would address now, just because it seemed to fit. Somebody said, I'm confused because our college CAEP people tell us that because our school counseling program is CACREP accredited, we don't need to participate in the self-study of CAEP, that CACREP, because it's already CHIA accredited, supersedes CAEP. I think this, and somebody else can speak up as well. In my experience, I think it just varies. I have always I've worked at a couple different institutions, always with CAEP accredited education programs, including school counseling, and always with CACREP accredited school counseling programs. I personally have never had to write anything to CAEP, because I've never been in an institution where they required me to submit anything. I believe that sometimes that's an institutional decision. I believe that sometimes that's a state level decision. And so if you're not sure or you're confused as to why, I mean, it's very possible you don't have to do anything for CAEP. But I would absolutely speak with your college level or institutional level accreditation folks to get clarity on that, and make sure that you're checking with the state to make sure that they don't require it. It just varies. Does somebody else want to chime in?
Yes, this is Mandy. I've actually tried to advocate quite a bit, I think, on the larger Virginia scene to allow CACREP's accreditation to stand for our counselor education programs and institutions in Virginia. It is definitely a state by state decision, and it very much depends on your state partnership agreement. And so if you, anyone in the audience, if you're concerned or confused or just unsure about where your state stands in terms of whether your CACREP accreditation stands alone, and does not, that you don't need to submit anything specific for CAEP, I would just encourage you to Google, whatever your state is, and then CAEP partnership agreement. So for example, Tennessee CAEP partnership agreement, and you should be able to actually find the document, and it'll spell out for you exactly what your state expects. And so in Virginia, the rub is that there's language in the regulations and in our Virginia CAEP partnership agreement that specifies that all programs preparing educators has to be accredited by the national accrediting body. And while CACREP is in fact a national accrediting body, it's viewed, I guess, as from Virginia's perspective as a specialty. So it's a SPA from Virginia's perspective. And so therefore, yes, they want all programs to be accredited by CACREP, but they being the VDOE and legislature, views CAEP as the national accrediting body. And therefore, because of that very specific language, we're beholden to both.
Thank you. Yeah, and just for clarity, like for those of us who've been like in my situation, we still had to show evidence that we were CACREP accredited. We had to show the outcomes of our self-study. It's not that, they don't just trust us. So there's, maybe a document that we have to share with them. But other than that, and again, things change over time too. So somebody just chimed in, that when they were at App State, something was different. But again, year by year, I think it's just a matter of you keeping up with what your state requirements are, asking questions, not making assumptions of what you do or don't have to do, because that's when, things get into trouble. Somebody else, again, while we're here, made a comment that I'm not sure that I can answer definitively. If a school needs to be ASCA approved, and we're going to get to the ASCA SPA a little later, this study, and I'm assuming the CAEP self-study will probably need to be done. I think I'm going to save that question for when we start talking about the ASCA SPA and see if I can try to address that. But for now, and I'm just looking at our time, we're going to keep plugging forward with our talking points, and we'll have time at the end for more questions. So we'll keep looking at these as they come in. But thank you, panelists, for sharing such great information about what you're noticing, similarities and differences.
Okay, so we're going to shift a little bit to talking about any challenges. So we've heard, I think, a lot of the approaches to meeting different sets of standards and examples of how that work has been done or being done. But we anticipate that there are challenges that our panelists might have encountered or may anticipate dealing with. So I think Mandy, you spoke to, for example, the nuances in standards and different jargon, and maybe just challenges to managing the process or different timelines. There might be challenges to think about with different follow-up processes, you know, with 3 years out when you think about follow-up graduates. So Mandy, first, could you speak to some of the challenges that you can maybe have experienced or you're thinking that you may come across down the future?
Sure. So one that came to mind as I was thinking about this webinar, because I'm very much in the thick of it right now, just because of our timeline, is the difference in CACREP and CAEP expectations for program developed instruments. So those are like your alumni surveys, or your clinical observation rubrics, or any assessment, key assessment for which you from which you pull data to evidence meeting the CAEP standards and the CACREP standards. But just from a CAEP perspective, there are more specific, I think, requirements related to evidence of validity and reliability for assessments that are developed by programs. So the distinction here is a proprietary assessment, so something that's created by like an ETS or a Pearson or some other testing body that goes through the whole test development cycle and provides public information about the validity and reliability of their licensure assessments. Versus program developed assessments like those surveys, where we're collecting information from our alumni, like now that you're in your profession, looking back on your preparation, what do you think we did well? What do you think we should improve upon? So CAEP has very specific expectations around evidence of validity and reliability. Surveys, you don't have to really demonstrate evidence of reliability, but there is the expectation that you demonstrate evidence of validity for surveys specifically. So making sure, it's important to make sure that not only do your surveys align to your KPIs for CACREP and do get you the data that are required for CACREP for your annual reports and then for your reaccreditation self-studies, but then also making sure that you're aligning your instruments to CAEP's expectations for surveys or CAEP's expectations for observation rubrics and things of that nature. That's a big challenge, and particularly because when programs are meeting their specialty area standards, a lot of times it's permitted by those specialty areas for tweaks or just small changes from year to year to occur with the instrument, just to make sure that you're collecting the data that are necessary, or you're phrasing the items in ways that your respondents are understanding what you're looking for clearly, and you're resulting you're getting the data that you need as a result. But for CAEP, I think the sort of implicit, if not explicit, expectation is, you demonstrate evidence of validity and in some cases reliability for an instrument, and then that instrument does not change, because anytime you change an instrument significantly, you then have to demonstrate, as we all understand, I think, updated evidence of validity, because you've made a change. So now the results or the conclusions that you can draw based on the data resulting from that instrument are different, or could be different. And so that's something I think that programs, especially advanced program areas, have a hard time thinking about upfront. Like, we should really think about the changes that we're making to instruments on an annual basis, and even to things like syllabi on an annual basis. And if we are making changes regularly, we need to demonstrate that we're still meeting the standards and collecting data that actually do result in valid conclusions, and that we can demonstrate that 7 years from now, when our next CAEP cycle comes up.
Thank you, Mandy. So I just want to see if you can speak further to this. So at our institution, we are going through our CAEP visit, and we'll have our visit in October. But as you were mentioning, that our college is going through that process of ensuring that all of our program evaluation instruments were reliable and valid. And at that time, we started to, as a CACREP accredited program, enter into that process. But then, very quickly, they were saying, you're CACREP accredited, so you really don't have to go through all of this. But I do remember going through initially, we have assignments where one of our KPIs might be measured through an assignment, but that assignment, we have a rubric aligned to that assignment. So can you speak to that requirement for reliability and validity, and going through a process so that if you're CACREP accredited and you are using rubrics, how do programs go through that fidelity check for rubrics and grading, make sure there's consistency?
Sure. So the first thing that I would recommend, and of course, so going back to the comment that you made about, if you're CACREP accredited, then you don't necessarily need to go through all this. Of course, that again is, state specific. And so Virginia, we do have to make sure that we're meeting the CAEP instrument requirements. And the first thing that I would recommend that anyone do is go on the CAEP website, or just Google CAEP assessment instrument rubric. And that is CAEP's, we jokingly, but maybe not so much jokingly, refer to it as the meta rubric, or the rubric on rubrics. And that is CAEP's guide for site reviewers who are reviewing an institution's or a program's instruments, like their rubrics and their surveys, to guide them as to what to look for. And so for surveys, the emphasis is on validity. And so, well, I'll get back to that in just a moment. But then for rubrics, the evidence is both on validity and reliability. And so that not only includes things like, content validity, but that also includes things like ensuring that you are training your site supervisors, or anyone who's going to use a particular rubric and to evaluate a candidate, that you're training them in a really consistent way, so that everyone is using that rubric or that instrument in the way that you need them to, and in a way that for which you can demonstrate evidence of reliability and fidelity. And so I would start with the CAEP rubric, because that gives you specific look-fors. And then if you're looking at the CAEP, that CAEP rubric and the CAEP accreditation handbook for advanced programs, specifically around standard 5, they're going to give you some suggestions for ways that you can demonstrate evidence of validity. And one of the really common ways that I've come across and that I've used is to gather a group of experts, of stakeholders from the field, and that can be site supervisors, faculty, specific site mentors, or cooperating mentors at clinical sites. Gather those folks together, bring them together for an hour, feed them, have them go through the instrument and provide feedback to you on the clarity of the items, and whether or not they appear to align to the standards that you have identified for each, criteria or criterion, and just have that conversation and document it. And then, going forward, don't make any changes unless, don't make any significant changes, because any changes that you're going to make, again, are going to potentially change the conclusions that you can draw from the results. If you do find that you need to make specific changes to an instrument, bring those folks back and just make sure, or, even virtually send it out to them and say, this is what we determined the last time we met about this particular instrument. We made some changes to the language or to the items. Do you see any issues? Can you give us some feedback, and just document that evidence as well?
Great, thank you, Mandy, for sharing that. Because that is certainly a difference. It could present a challenge for individuals who are CACREP and have used to having certain types of instruments to now start going through this process. So, Michelle, could you speak to any challenges that you've encountered or may anticipate dealing with?
Sure. So I would definitely agree with that assessment piece. That was one of the first things that we discussed in our last meeting. But beyond just the assessments, it's also how to maintain this information for us. So our counseling department is moving from using hard copy paper data to an online portfolio and accountability system. We really saw the need for this during our last CACREP reaccreditation, because of the time-consuming process of going through paper and compiling this information into spreadsheets. We tried to do this a few years ago with the one that the College of Ed used, but it just didn't seem to match with the needs of our faculty and our students. And so we're going to one that's specifically used for counseling and other related areas. And so we're really hoping that this new program is going to reduce our challenges that we've experienced, be more in sync with CACREP, and help us provide this evidence that we are meeting the CAEP standards as well.
Great. So I think that as you're looking at our programs looking at meeting both the standards, there's going to be a lot more data that might be collected or might need to be housed differently.
Right.
So if someone doesn't have software or a package that they've been using, that might be a consideration.
Right, that's what we have really seen as the need. As we're starting to enter this process, coming out of CACREP, going into CAEP, we thought we'd need to do this, approach this a little bit differently to help make sure. And then plus through doing that, we'll be able to, any areas like Blair has mentioned, any extras, any deficits will be more apparent, and we can put those into place, like the, assessing for 3 years.
So Mandy and Michelle, before we move on to the next slide, is there anything else you want to share with it related to this talking point?
I think from my perspective, I've just about covered most of the challenges that we have dealt with so far, at least.
Thank you.
Okay, our final talking point before Sejal and I kind of give some summary information and some more on the ASCA SPA. And I think we've probably, offered a few tips and tricks throughout, but I'm wondering if our panelists can talk about any advice or other thoughts that they have for people who are considering or who are being required to pursue accreditation through both CACREP and CAEP. Blair, or can we start with you with anything you want to share?
Sure. I just think, I don't know about you guys, but a lot of times when we think about accreditation, the anxiety rises in terms of the amount of work and so forth. And so I think the biggest tip or advice I would say is just the crosswalks are really helpful, and they've helped me lower my anxiety about what I need to do. And also if you have someone in terms of director of assessment, working closely with them as someone in your program, if you're in charge of accreditation for your program, to be working closely with them. We're lucky to have Mandy, and potentially some schools don't have that. I would imagine there has to be someone coordinating everything. I would say the close relationship, and then just using the crosswalks as much as possible to really recognize you do have a lot of what you need, and then finding those gaps. And so Mandy and I are actually having a meeting to talk about where the gaps are so that we can start putting things in place to rectify them. And I don't know, that just really, when you're getting anxious, go back to the crosswalk. That's about it.
Thank you very much. Mandy, do you have anything else to add to that?
I think that was a great point for sure. So I think, again, I'm sort of at the beginning, like staring down, the next year and a half writing the CAEP self-study. But what I think is going to be really helpful, and what I noticed as Blair went through the process of preparing the self-study for our CACREP review, was to really start by looking at your report template first. So I just went through yesterday and looked at our CACREP, our CAEP self-study report template through AIMS, which is CAEP's online, I don't know what AIMS stands for, but it's their platform where the self-study report is submitted and you submit all of your evidence for your site visit. And so I just went through and looked at the template and looked at all the sections that were required and how we're required to respond to the particular standards and to questions that are sprinkled throughout the template. And then I just sat for a while and thought about all of the different pieces of evidence that I need to make sure that I am collecting everything ahead of time and having it all in one place, so that when I sit down to start writing and to start tagging evidence to standards, I have it all at my fingertips. And it's sounding like, I'm going to be sitting in front of my computer for the next year and a half and doing this, and that's not the case. So we, just as I think Blair mentioned, we have a strong team of program coordinators for all of the CAEP accredited programs that are going to go through this site review. And I have my associate dean, who's really advocating for us to get us resources and time to spend together to really dig into the evidence and do some writing. And so, reach out to the folks in your institution who are going to be your key ambassadors to programs and who will be able to collaborate with you, but really spend some time, maybe 6 months or so at the beginning, just getting all of your evidence and all of your instruments and everything together, data from your instruments, but also data about your instruments, so your validity and reliability data and how all of your homegrown, program grown instruments were developed, the history of that process, get it all in one place, and then start pulling and start writing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. It sounds like you're saying, trying to jump into the writing before you have all that stuff is probably more difficult. So work opposite of what you might be inclined to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mary, did you have anything to share here as well? I think we...
Certainly, I can add a couple of points here. I do agree with what has been said early on. By the way, AIMS is the Accreditation Information Management System. So that's been around for a long time. We've been using that with NCAEP, NCACREP. That's what it stands for. Nothing spectacular. Do start early. I agree with that. Being very familiar with both sets of standards, so you know what you need to have well before you need that. Keep good records and share data. We have an internal website where we will be housing data, and both raw data and formatted data, and our writing, so that as we work through this, we can have shared space to share data back and forth. So I think that's important.
Thank you. Yeah, and if I can, I'll add right to that. Based on my experience with the shared sites, I learned the hard way a couple years ago that people accidentally delete things, and so I think having some version of all of these shared documents that only perhaps 1 or 2 people have access to edit is important, and then having another version where so that you don't accidentally lose things and have people feel bad, and but having everybody access to see everything seems really, really important. We had 2 people send in a question related to some of the stuff we just talked about, wondering if any of us were willing to share some of the assessment platforms we were using. And I'd say this is not our place to endorse or, support or promote any of these online systems, but I think Michelle had mentioned just getting access to some system. Are you willing to share, Michelle, which?
And that's why I didn't say, because I wasn't sure about saying the name of it either on the webinar.
I think if we're just giving people options, I think we can throw out the names that they could explore on their own. Maybe that's
great. That's why I left it out, just to make sure before. So we do not have quite access yet. We've had several meetings. We're getting all of our papers together. We should go hopefully live with it in August. But it looks like it should match the needs of what our program is, and that is Tavera.
Okay, thank you. I have had experience with live text, and I have had experience with TK20, and there was some other one years ago, I can't remember. What about others? What programs that people use?
This is Mary. Live Text and TK20, and I've forgotten the other one too. Task Stream.
Yeah.
They have all joined together. They're all under Watermark right now. But we've used the Live Text platform, which is all now Watermark.
Yeah, and we, so I've used TaskStream at UConn. That's what I used. And then, Curry currently uses, particularly in our teacher education program, they've been using Chalk and Wire for a number of years. And Chalk and Wire was just sort of brought under an umbrella company that I can't remember the name of, but it's still, you can still find information on Chalk and Wire. But I would also say, so all of these programs can be helpful. And if you or your program or institution don't have the resources for investing in something like that, it's possible to create your own sort of program just using things like Google Drive to make sure that you're collecting data from multiple programs, multiple individuals throughout the year. Just make sure you're collecting criterion level data for each of your students on each particular criterion that is required to provide evidence for CACREP and CAEP. And I'm happy to share some resources afterwards if anybody has questions about that.
Thank you. I think at this point, Sejal and I are going to share again some overview kind of summary crosswalk information, and then we're going to save some time for questions. So.
Great. So lots of good advice and tips shared. And so I just want to note that Amy and I have not had to meet both sets of standards. We have our CACREP accreditation, but our institutions are not requiring us to meet CAEP. They just recognize us through our CACREP accreditation. So what we did was we just wanted to offer the audience just a holistic perspective of approaching if you're in the event that your institution, your program has to meet both sets of standards. And so what we tried to do is, again, as shared before, to provide an example of a crosswalk to look at the CAEP standards and CACREP. And so essentially, I think what we see here is when we look at professional clinical practice, for example, we look at the language of what that means in terms of high quality for CAEP. The development of knowledge, skills, and dispositions, and the impact. I think that was mentioned before, is that CAEP looks at the impact on P12 students. And then CACREP, we look at our theory and the application of those counseling skills and really representing the ethnic and demographic diversity of the community. So that's a piece that we tack on in terms of the community aspect and impact. And then academic achievement. So when we think about CAEP, seeing that they want to see data on candidates meeting the institution or state minimum criteria. And then for CACREP, that is essentially the KPIs, key performance indicators under the 2016 standards that requires us to look at each student's progress throughout the program, whether it's the academic performance or dispositional. And then continuous improvement. So for CAEP, they do require multiple measures of candidates. So that could be looking at goals and standards, and then including stakeholders. That was mentioned before, that stakeholders are involved in whether it be helping to validate instruments, and they're also trained to use those instruments, but they're also involved in that program evaluation improvement piece. And then likewise, and similarly with CACREP, that is essentially also Section 4 of the 2016 standards, where we do have multiple measures. For CACREP, it requires multiple measures over time. We require a systematic evaluation plan of student learning objectives. And then we also reflect for having input from all stakeholders. So we can see that there are certain areas of overlap. And so I think when we get specific into these standards, the jargon, the different criteria might be different, but overall, I think holistically, when we look at them, there are several places where we can look to join the work that's already been doing. And I think that the crosswalk that was shared by Blair and UVA that's using, I think that's a great example of how to demonstrate meeting both assessment standards, even though that the language might be different. Amy, did you want to add anything to that?
I'm sorry, did you say Mandy?
Andy, I'm sorry, Amy. Amy, are you there?
Can you hear me now? Uh-oh.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. No, I attempted to say that I think our panelists did such a really good job of kind of highlighting some of the things I think we were hoping to convey here. I think we're covered.
Okay, great. So let me move on to the next slide, get more specific.
Okay, so let me just say, we're not here pretending in any way to be experts in the ASCA SPA, but we thought that it was important to highlight them. Those of you who are connected to school counseling probably have heard about and or received information about the ASCA SPA standards being released. I think it was late January that Angela Hickman sent out the link, I know through the ASCA scene, if you're signed up for that social media. I know they have information on their website with details about the ASCA SPA standards. For those who may not be familiar, within CAEP, every specialty area has the possibility of having what they call a SPA, or a specialized program area, which is basically where the curricular content standards are housed for, special ed or math ed or school psych. And school counseling now has a subset of standards that fall under CAEP. I think, again, the question came up earlier, if a program either has to or wants to pursue the ASCA SPA standards, do they have to pursue CAEP? I think that's my understanding, but I'd say that's a question to clarify with ASCA, because I don't want to pretend to answer that, but I'm not sure how you would pursue the ASCA SPA standards independently of CAEP. I'm not sure if somebody else knows the answer to that who's on our panelists, but again, I would personally refer you to ASCA for that. My understanding is the SPA standards are not, I'm going to say operational yet. They've just been released, and it takes, programs have to show a couple years worth of data collection. So nobody is actually, in the process of writing to those SPA standards yet. So this is very premature. But what we thought we wanted to do as we looked at the curricular standards that ASCA mapped out, we immediately saw an incredible amount of overlap with the CACREP standards, specifically the CACREP standards in Section 2 that are all those curriculum areas, human growth and development, group counseling, professional identity, that sort of thing, and with the school counseling specialty area standards specifically. So what we've mapped out here, obviously, the ASCA SPA addresses, various knowledge and skill areas that are relevant to school counseling that they've deemed important. And CACREP obviously has mapped out knowledge and skill areas that they deemed relevant to school counseling, not just in the specialty area, but within the core counseling curriculum area as well. ASCA has 7, what I will just call broad standards, with substandards under each of those. CACREP again has the 8 core areas in Section 2, and then the school counseling specialty area kind of as a standalone. And again, when we looked at crosswalking those, again, although the language is often quite different, I think if you really get to the heart of what they're asking you to look at in terms of content, there's pretty much a lot of similarity. So it shouldn't be hopefully too overwhelming to think about writing to both of those standards or teaching content relevant to both of those. In terms of assessment, ASCA is saying that at least partial evidence has to be provided for all of the subcomponents that they're looking at through a minimum of 6 different assessments. So, and CACREP, at this point in time, programs are able to choose what they want to focus on within all of those standards, and that they have to at least assess 9 broad areas, again, the 8 core areas, and the school counseling specialty area, using multiple measures over multiple points in time. I think if you parcel those down, there's a lot, again, that can overlap in how you might assess for ASCA SPA versus how you might assess for CACREP. And again, what ways can you assess? identically, it's like programs have the ability to choose what makes sense. And so I think probably a lot of what you're already doing in your programs can be used across both of those areas. Again, this is just based on our quick read and visually making a comparison. You know, as I think about, does my program perhaps want to pursue the ASCA SPA? What would that look like? It doesn't seem like it would be as overwhelming perhaps as it could be. I don't know if Sejal or if anybody else has any thoughts on this one.
I would just like to say that, you know, as we're looking at these ESSA standards, they clearly don't have to be mutually exclusive, and that, you know, meeting them, that if you're you know, CACREP already, it might be easy to meet the ASCA SPA or the other way around, because there doesn't have to be a choice in terms of which one you have to go with.
This is Mary. Can I jump in here? In a prior experiences, I worked with the SPA, the whole SPA area, and the SPAs would fall underneath. The way I understand SPAs, they will fall underneath the CACREP or the CAEP. CAEP and CACREP are on, say, the same level, as you might say, under the CHIA heading, and then the SPAs fall underneath them. And what has happened before in the past with NCATE and CAEP, if your SPA, your Specialty Professional Association, recognized your program in terms of knowledge and skills and the 7 standards and the evidence and the methods that you're doing, it wasn't a just automatically we don't investigate, but it was sort of a check that, okay, this is a huge chunk that the Specialty Professional Association has said are fine, so that leads into CAEP Standard 1. So if that helps to explain just a little bit about how the SPAs work. I know with CAEP, it may be the same underneath the CACREP. I'm not positive, but I'm suspecting that that may be the case. In that you can, now in our state in Tennessee, we do not have to pursue SPA recognition, but we must do something to indicate to the state that we are knowledge skills assessment is all there, but it does fall underneath the CAEP heading, or probably CACREP.
Yes,
So
thank you, Mary. And yeah, the ASCA SPA falls under CAEP. It is not affiliated with CACREP, so that's where I think, you know, we don't have the expertise to speak to the ASCA SPA,
Okay.
but it will fall. And your explanation, I think, is helpful. Something that you said made me think. I guess I can try to clarify as well. It seems possible that there are some states that will require that if a SPA exists for a specialty area, that the program must seek recognition under that SPA. Some states don't, and so like right now where I am, we have the choice. If we wanted to pursue the ASCA SPA, we could, but the state is not going to force us to. And so again, that's where you need to seek the clarity from your institution and from your state as to what is or is not required for you moving forward with these with this SPA in particular.
And yes, I would agree. And look at the CAEP state agreement, that partnership agreement, because some states note that if you are CAEP accredited or you're going for CAEP, you must do SPAs if they exist. In Tennessee, we are given the option. We do not have to seek SPA recognition and we may still seek CAEP accreditation.
Mm-hmm.
The
Thank you.
SPAs will only recognize, not accredit.
Right, and I think that's an important distinction, yeah. So again, ASCA has a lot of information on their website. We just wanted to make sure that we introduced and tried to make what we saw as some comparisons, but there's a lot, you know, moving forward that will probably come out to help as well. So I think the big thing we have tried to show, and I think our panelists were super helpful in showing there is a lot of overlap. Hopefully, you all are, having the ability to decide or pursue what it is that makes sense for you or what's required for you, but that hopefully maybe things might not be as daunting. You're doing some of the things that you've already got in place and figuring out how you can double dip, so to speak, intentionally. But that you shouldn't have to, feel forced to choose one or the other, or pressure to do that if it doesn't make sense. We have about 10 more minutes. I don't know if anybody has any questions they feel like typing in, or if any of the panelists or anyone else has anything to share, we can wrap up.
This is Mary. I want to make one comment to something that was mentioned earlier, in that when CAEP comes, as they have done with NCATE, I believe this is how it will happen, that yes, they will recognize, and you can just submit the paperwork. We will submit the paperwork from the CACREP accreditation, and it will be, as like I mentioned with the SPAs, that they will say, okay, well, we may look briefly, but we're not going to look terribly deep. As the same, we submit accreditation paperwork from our colleagues in music, our colleagues in art who have their own accrediting bodies, our colleagues in school psychology who have their own accrediting body. So we can submit that paperwork and then they are given more of a cursory look. But it's true, the data does overlap, and gathering some of the same data, so you're not gathering for two totally different sets of data. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. I think
Thank
so.
you.
I see no questions coming in, so maybe that's really good that we answered all your questions, or you're just so overwhelmed that you don't know what to ask. But either way, Sejal, is there anything else we should share?
No, I think we might have overwhelmed people. I don't know, but this has been very helpful and informative. So I really just want to thank our panelists for sharing their experiences and expertise in doing this work. So thus far, because again, we don't know right now. My state or my institution is not requiring us to explore or meet these extra set of standards, but that could change. And so I think it's important for our audience to stay in tune with what our state requirements are and what our institutions are requiring. But that's all.
Thank you, everybody, for participating.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Amy, Sejal, and all of our presenters today. As usual, this recording will be up and available to all of ACE's membership within about 2 weeks. If anyone has any questions, anything comes up, feel free to send me an email at socialmedia@acesonline.net. And I want to thank, again, all of our presenters and all of our attendees for being a part of the webinar today.
Thank you, Eric.